right. Well, the honor of introducing Professor John Kincaid actually falls to me today, and I'm very happy to do so. Professor Kincaid has been an inspiration to many of us who work in federalism studies, including those of us who don't study the U.S. I've been involved for a number of years in the federalism section of the American Political Science Association, where John has been involved, and one of the key awards that we offer is named after him. So it's especially an honor to introduce him. So Professor Kincaid is an American political scientist and scholar of American federalism, intergovernmental institutions, and state and local government. He's a professor of government and public service at Lafayette College, director of the Minor Center for the Study of State and Local Government, president of the Center for the Study of Federalism, and an elected fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. And he's also co-editor of the Rutledge book series on federalism and decentralization. And today he is going to speak to us on American federalism's responses to crisis, resilience through continuity. So, Professor Kincaid.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that kind invitation, and I appreciate your invitation to attend the conference. I regret that I could not attend the conference in person. I really always enjoy visiting India. I would have loved to have come for the conference, but this is the last week of classes for our semester, and in fact, I have a class to teach 5 hours from now, so it was really impossible for me to get away for that reason. My paper's theme is resilience through continuity in American federalism responses to crises. President Barack Obama's new chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, famously said in 2008, "You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. It's an opportunity to do things you couldn't do before." Although Winston Churchill first made this comment near the end of World War II when he supported creation of the United Nations, Emanuel sought to harness potential responses to the 2008 financial crisis through the excitement following the election of America's first black president. The results for some bold initiatives by the federal government harnessed, though, to the exigencies of American federalism. So one of the system's exigencies is the continued constitutional and political strength of the states, despite considerable centralization occurring over 233 years. Centralization has been mostly incremental and rarely driven by sudden leaps during crises. Another exigency of the system is a strong, though mostly informal, system of intergovernmental interaction that mitigates incremental centralization by including the states as partners in policy implementation. The federal government is rarely able to go it alone, so to speak, and usually has no appetite to do so, even when the federal Constitution seemingly enables it to act alone. Now, this exigency is due partly to an 1819 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that allowed states to enact bankruptcy laws even though the federal Constitution seems to assign the power to regulate bankruptcy exclusively to Congress. Essentially, the court held in 1819 that whenever Congress does not exercise its exclusive powers, states can do so. Indeed, Congress did not enact a permanent bankruptcy law until 1898, 109 years after Congress had been given seemingly exclusive power over bankruptcy. The 1898 law preempted, that is, it suspended state bankruptcy laws and removed bankruptcy from state courts to federal courts. However, in doing so, Congress preserved some state powers over certain aspects of bankruptcy. This has largely been a pattern since 1898. States have exercised a vast array of seemingly exclusive federal powers over the domestic economy and other domestic affairs during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Consequently, as centralization has progressed incrementally since 1898, Congress has used its constitutional authority to preempt more and more of states' powers. But In doing so, Congress almost always preserves realms of state authority because states fought to retain authority. In addition, preserving realms of state powers enhances the legitimacy of federal power expansions with the voters in Congress members' home states and districts. So this pattern of federal preemption with state power preservation has applied to crises as well. Now, in turn, in the mid-20th century, when Congress, under expansive interpretations of the federal Constitution, began enacting laws on health, education, environmental protection, and other social matters that had traditionally belonged to the states, Congress did so by paying states with intergovernmental transfers to implement those policies. These intergovernmental dimensions of the federal system, therefore, really enable all orders of government, federal, state, and local, to engage in crisis management. Another exigency of American federalism is a robust federal constitution that is one of the most difficult to amend among national constitutions worldwide. Amending the federal constitution requires broad consensus across most states and localities. Consequently, the Constitution has not become just another piece of ordinary legislation to be altered frequently by political forces at play in the federal system. The 233-year-old Constitution has only 27 amendments. The importance of the Constitution was cemented into American political culture by President Abraham Lincoln, who presided over the greatest crisis in American federalism, the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. At every turn, Lincoln insisted on the importance of maintaining the rule of law, especially constitutional law. At the same time, prevent the Constitution from becoming a cage and political actors engaged in interpretation, though under the constraint of accepting the courts as the federal Constitution's principal interpreter, including the authority of the U.S. Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional. Hence, as Alexis de Tocqueville observed in the 1830s, quote, "The judge is one of the most important political powers in the United States." So consequently, states challenge in federal court provisions of federal policies they dislike. States don't always prevail, but at times the threat of litigation persuades Congress to alter or delete provisions in bills disliked by states. A further exigency of American federalism is the political party system. Following on William Riker's observation about the importance of political parties in shaping federal systems, especially centralization versus decentralization, parties in the United States have been prime movers of the form and balance of power in the American federal system. And this was very evident in the U.S. response to COVID-19. And so let me put some evidence behind these general statements. Looking at three crises, we can see these exigencies at work. On September 11, 2001, it was local police, fire, medical personnel, and other officials who responded to the destruction of the two World Trade Center towers in New York City, destruction of a portion of the U.S. Department of Defense's Pentagon building in Arlington, Virginia, and destruction of United Flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers revolted against the hijackers who planned to crash the aircraft into the White House or Congress. State governments were the secondary responders, the federal government was the tertiary responders. Neighboring states and localities also sent personnel and equipment to help New York City. The federal government soon provided financial assistance to New York City and later provided financial compensation to families of the deceased victims of the terrorist attacks and also to several thousand injured victims of those attacks. The federal government also is compensating state and local personnel and volunteers who have contracted lung diseases from rescuing people and clearing the rubble from the collapse of the Twin Towers. A federal legislation enacted in response to the terrorist attacks somewhat centralized national security power within the federal government, but not the federal system as a whole. The federal government created a Department of Homeland Security to consolidate various relevant agencies, including the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA for short, which had been semi-independent. FEMA is the principal federal agency responsible for assisting state and local governments in coping with natural and human disasters. Little change was made in FEMA's performance of that assistance when it was absorbed into Homeland Security. The federal government also encouraged each state to establish its own equivalent of a Department of Homeland Security. All states did so, and relations developed quickly between those state departments and the Federal Department of Homeland Security. The federal government created new grant programs also to provide financial assistance to state and local governments for terrorism response and prevention activities. The federal government enhanced its intelligence capabilities, and so did many states and big cities. For example, New York City constructed a sizable and sophisticated intelligence system, which includes New York police intelligence personnel stationed in 13 cities in countries around the world. The federal government also provided financial assistance to help states create fusion centers. Fusion centers are state-owned and operated centers that serve as focal points in states and major urban areas for the receipt, analysis, gathering, and sharing of threat-related information between state, local, tribal, territorial, and federal officials, as well as private sector partners. The federal government also established the Transportation Security Agency, which, among other things, created passenger checkpoints at all airports. This was technically centralizing because airports are constructed and maintained by local governments, but local officials are happy not to shoulder the costs and responsibility of staffing those checkpoints. One friction point was President George Bush's calling up state National Guard units for service in the war in Afghanistan. Each state has an Army and Air Force National Guard under the command of the governor. Governors deploy these forces primarily for rescues and disaster relief. Some governors complained that the president was depleting their forces, leaving states understaffed to respond to local disasters. As a result, more than half the states would like to limit presidential authority to call up National Guard units for combat deployment outside the United States. So on the whole, the federal system's response to the terrorist attacks of 2001 was intergovernmentally cooperative, largely because the two political parties agreed on many tolerance treaty responses, and because states and localities faced terrorist threats regardless of their party affiliation. The federal government largely adhered to existing intergovernmental practices and fit new policy initiatives into those channels or followed existing practices when creating new channels. As a result, responses to the crisis remain within constitutional bounds with respect to federalism. Response to the financial crisis of 2008-2009 was more conflictual. The two parties disagreed on the causes of the crisis and thus the solutions. Generally, Democrats attributed the key cause of the crisis to federal regulatory failures. Federal deregulation of banks and other financial institutions since the early 1980s created, in their view, a lax climate of casino capitalism characterized by excessive risk-taking, rooted in exotic investment products not fully understood even by so-called Wall Street experts. Thus, financial regulators failed to prevent this large risk buildup. Generally, Republicans attributed the key cause of the crisis to federal housing policies that fostered the emergence of a subprime mortgage market that allowed people to purchase homes at inflated prices that were beyond their financial means. These high-risk mortgages were repackaged, sold to investors around the world, and also used as collateral for exotic investments. When this scheme collapsed in the fall of 2007, 27 million high-risk mortgages had originated in the United States, thus triggering a broader financial meltdown that produced a recession that began in December 2007. So the Republican view that prime culprits were the Federal National Mortgage Association and Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation. These are corporate enterprises set up and sponsored by the federal government 40 years earlier. Although there was bipartisan agreement that the federal government had to be the epicenter of responses to the financial crisis, there were disagreements over the proper responses. Democrats supported Keynesian policies that vastly increased government spending as the best way to restart the economy. Given that Democrats controlled both the White House and Congress during 2009-2010, economic stimulus spending was the predominant federal response to the crisis, putting aid to prevent state and local governments from reducing their spending during the recession. Republicans advocated so-called supply-side policies, principally tax cuts to re-stimulate the economy, along with government spending cuts to reduce deficits. Given that Republicans were the minority party in Congress in 2008-2010, they did not achieve those objectives, but they did mitigate the Democratic policies. The first major federal response was $160 billion of federal spending and temporary tax rebates enacted in February 2008 under President Bush. A second major response is major legislation that addressed the subprime mortgage crisis. Among other things, the federal law authorized states to refinance subprime loans using mortgage revenue bonds. The law also established a neighborhood stabilization fund to help local governments purchase foreclosed properties. The third big early response was the Troubled Asset Relief Program of October 2008. TARP for short was enacted to buy toxic mortgage derivatives, but being unable to price those derivatives, the U.S. Treasury invested TARP funds in banks and other financial and non-financial firms, thus acquiring equity in those firms that would allow those businesses to gradually write off those assets against profits earned from the Federal Reserve's zero interest rate. Over time, the federal government recovered its TARP funds as well as interest income. When President Barack Obama came into office as a result of the 2008 election, his biggest achievement was a $787 billion, 1,100-page American Recovery and Investment Stimulus Act enacted in February 2009, which provided about $250 billion to state and local governments for specific functions, of which about $130 billion was targeted for immediate fiscal relief, mostly for Medicaid, which is our health insurance program for the poor. It's a joint federal-state program administered by the states, and also for public education. Rather than establish a separate recovery bureaucracy, the White House coordinated with 15 federal implementing agencies, overseeing 215 funding lines and 86 existing grant programs. Most funds, therefore, were distributed through existing formulas for federal aid programs, which usually require some state and local financial matches. Although these established programs and formulas allowed rapid disbursement of funds, the formulas did not always reflect current economic realities. Consequently, states and localities hit hardest by the recession did not necessarily receive the most stimulus money. In August 2010, Congress enacted a program to provide $16 billion to extend for another 6 months the increased Medicaid assistance to the states that was provided in the Recovery Act, and $10 billion to prevent layoffs of school teachers during the recession. Now, the major regulatory response was enactment of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act in 2010 that overhauled the nation's financial regulation system. With respect to federalism, the principal issue in formulating this law was the extent to which the federal government would preempt state financial regulatory powers. The United States has had a dual, that is, federal and state banking system since the 1860s. This pattern was followed also in dual federal and state regulation of financial services, consumer protection, telecommunications, and other matters. In addition, states have always been the primary regulators of the insurance industry. Although there were some significant attempts to preempt many areas of state regulation, even though the financial crisis was not precipitated by state regulatory failures, the law generally protected extant state regulatory authority in areas of consumer protection and banking. It even reversed some Bush-era preemptions, including some broad Bush preemption policies. Now, a major reason for this friendly treatment of the states was that in contrast to the strong business pressures to preempt state powers, because business prefers to be regulated by one 500-pound gorilla in Washington than by 50 monkeys on steroids, most Democrats wish to maintain state regulatory powers over many facets of consumer protection of the economy. So consequently, Democrats either oppose these kinds of preemptions or they support what's called partial preemptions, whereby the federal government establishes minimum regulatory standards and allows states to establish higher or more stringent regulatory standards. By contrast, Republicans more often support total federal preemptions of state laws affecting business, arguing that the national marketplace should not be fragmented by 50 state regulatory systems. The federal system's response to COVID-19 was substantially driven by extreme party polarization. Democrats and Republicans agreed that COVID was a major crisis. They disagreed sharply on the nature of the crisis and the appropriate responses to the crisis. The ironic result of the gridlock created by this party polarization was a kind of reversion of the 19th century dual federalism, in which the federal government performed its national duties while the states employed their traditional police powers to function as the principal practical responders. However, the states exhibited considerably diverse responses, although generally Democratic states emphasized stay-at-home policies and closures of schools and many businesses, supported mandates that citizens wear a mask, and mandates for vaccinations, and other related policies. Generally, Republican states either resisted such policies or ordered short-term closures and voluntary masking and vaccination policies. President Trump really made no effort to use the crisis to aggrandize federal power. He left most policy responses to the states and focused on federal provision of healthcare guidance and medical equipment and development of a vaccine against COVID. When many Democratic states refused to reopen schools and businesses when Trump wanted them to, President Trump at one point claimed he had the constitutional authority to override state powers to reopen schools and businesses. This pronouncement triggered tremendous criticism, so Trump never mentioned the idea again. Yet under Trump, Congress did pass several major laws responding to COVID with strong majority support from both Democrats and Republicans. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act allocated $192 billion to address health, hunger, unemployment, and sick leave policies, about half of which was distributed through existing intergovernmental programs. In March 2020, Congress passed the $2.2 trillion Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. This was the largest federal stimulus program in American history. Among the law's allocations, most directly affecting state and local governments, were $150 billion in direct aid to state and local governments, $260 billion for unemployment. Those programs are run by the states, $100 billion for hospitals, $45 billion for disaster relief, $30 billion for education, $25 billion for public transportation, and $8 billion for tribal governments. So altogether, the Act provided state, local, and tribal governments about $218 billion. Democrats had wanted much more money for state and local governments, but Republicans had opposed higher funding. After months of partisan fighting, a $900 billion coronavirus response and relief supplemental appropriations act was passed in December 2020. The new stimulus was primarily a continuation of funding from earlier laws, the biggest component being additional aid to small businesses. However, state and local governments helped administer much of the $121 billion in unemployment aid, $82 billion in elementary, secondary, and higher education grants, $72 billion in health programs, and $44 billion in transportation funding. Again, Congress relied on established intergovernmental practices and channels. A major disagreement continued to be over funding to aid state and local governments directly. Democrats supported such aid. Republicans argued that congressional Democrats wanted to bail out irresponsible Democratic state and local governments that damaged their economies with extensive and lengthy closures of schools and businesses. Well, Democrats gained control of the presidency and Congress in the 2020 elections. Congress and President Joseph Biden quickly passed, without a single Republican vote, a $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan that included a $350 billion coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds program. The funds were not entirely unrestricted. However, state and local governments were given broad discretion, provided expenditures fell within one of four broad classifications: spending related to health and economic impacts of the pandemic, paying for essential workers, funding programs that have been hit hard by the pandemic, and also infrastructure projects. Local governments directly received $130 billion, including special allocations for smaller cities that were not included in the previous law. The remainder of the funding sought to further support existing COVID relief for unemployment insurance, aid to schools, small business assistance, nutritional programs, assistance for families with children or the elderly, Medicare and Medicaid assistance for health care, and other human service provisions and safety net spending important to Democrats. So these three cases are the three most recent major crises in the United States illustrate the resilience of the federal system and thus its ability to sustain substantial continuity. Despite these crises, there was no notable centralization of power within the federal government. Instead, the federal government continued to work with and rely heavily on state and local governments. At the same time, we can see the political parties play pivotal roles, but they do so within judicially enforced constitutional boundaries and the path dependency of intergovernmental practices and channels that facilitate continuity with resiliency while also mitigating centralization. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and be happy to respond to or have a discussion with any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Professor Kincaid, for that fascinating talk. I think we have some time to collect some questions from the audience and ask you to respond if you would. So does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. This was indeed a very fascinating lecture. You carried us from 1819 to 2022. The feeling which I get is, that it is more a dispute between the two parties than between, states and the federal government. And that's true not just for USA, that's true for most places. Would you like to comment on it, on whether it is a question of state federation relationship, or it's a dispute or a perception issue between the two dominant political parties in the states?
Yes, in the United States, particularly in the last couple of decades, with rising polarization between the political parties, which affects not only leaders of the political parties, but also the rank and file. Much of the conflict has been between the two political parties. Now that does spill over into conflict between the states and the federal government, from the party that controls the federal government, then there's a great deal of conflict between the states and the federal government. So, President Biden, for example, the Republican states engage in more conflictual behavior with the federal government than do the Democratic states. And when the Republicans control the federal government, it's the Democratic states that engage in more conflictual behavior with the federal government. So these party differences do spill over to that extent in the intergovernmental arena.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, John Balberia. I had two questions for you. One is that split party control is common in federal systems, but in campaigning in the United States, is the idea pushed strongly that if there were congruence between the federal government and the state would progress or perform better. What is known in Indian federalism as the double-engine state government, being pulled by the same party at the center and in the states. The second question that I had was concerning the notion of uncooperative federalism. To what extent, particularly in the light of the anti-abortion ruling of the Supreme Court, is it possible for the states? I know it's been thrown back to the states, so in a sense, the answer lies there. But uncooperative federalism, to what extent can the states not cooperate if they disagree with particular diktats or mandates of the center, of the federal government?
I didn't fully understand the first question. Could you repeat the first question about campaigning? Yeah.
Well, when the campaigning is for the state legislature or for the state governor, the argument that if the voters vote in a party which is the same as the party in control at the federal level, it would be beneficial for the state. Is that argument at all used in the electoral campaign?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I understand that question. I can't recall any incident in the United States where that has come up in a state election. The state voters are generally not primed to consider the relationship between the state and the federal government. It's just not on their radar. So when they're voting on state legislatures or state governors, they're really responding to state issues, and they're not concerned about the party composition of the federal government. To some extent, the federal government is concerned about the party composition of the states, and another development in American federalism has been that both national political parties and their congressional arms raise money and put money into state elections to try particularly to get a governor of the same political party. So we do have, to that extent, national forces, including the parties in Congress, attempting to influence the outcome of state elections. But by and large, the voters really are not keyed into that issue. Regarding the notion of uncooperative federalism, that really depends on the policy field. In most cases, sufficient compromises have been made in federal legislation not to trigger a substantial amount of uncooperative behavior on the part of the states. Furthermore, federal agencies tend to defer to the states in terms of adapting federal programs to state conditions. state concerns. Now, this is a bit more likely, of course, to be in states controlled by the party of the president, since it's the executive branch that engages in the implementation of federal law, a little less in the case of the states controlled by the opposition party. The recourse that the states have increasingly used in the last several decades is to take the federal government to court. And so we have a large number of state attorneys general. Now that the Democrats have been in power, Republican attorneys general in the states have been suing the federal government quite frequently in federal court over a whole variety of issues. And when Republicans are controlling the federal government, Democratic state attorneys general will be suing the federal government over a large number of issues. So we have seen this kind of uncooperative behavior increase substantially. We did not see it, however, in any of the three crises that I mentioned. There was a minimum of uncooperative behavior in that respect. But it also depends on the particular policy areas. So one of the most intrusive federal laws was a health care law, the Affordable Care Act, enacted under President Obama, which required the states to establish marketplaces for their residents to purchase subsidized health insurance, that is, insurance health subsidized by the federal government. Interesting, that law allows the federal government to go into a state and establish a marketplace if the state refuses to do so. So in that case of uncooperative federalism, the federal government comes in and sets up a marketplace. And in fact, about half the states have done that. They refused to set up a marketplace, so the federal government came in and set up a marketplace for health insurance. So that's something very new under the sun in the American federal system, where the federal government comes in and does something like that. So I hope those were responsive to your questions.
John Harihar here. I have a question. Some years ago, you coined a term in regard to the US federalism as coercive federalism, in which you refer particularly to the role of the NGOs, how the federal government bypassed the state and directly handed over health program implementation to some NGOs. But in the case of the crisis management, I mean, COVID crisis, you didn't mention anything at all about the role the NGOs played, if at all, in the United States.
Okay, yeah, good question. So with respect to coercive federalism, my argument has been is that the federal government is ordinarily the top dog in policy making. And that was generally the case even during the crises. However, when it comes to the intergovernmental dimensions of those policies, we continue to see a considerable amount of cooperation in the implementation of those policies. So I guess to try to clarify, when it comes to making policy, Congress is much less really responsive directly to state and local governments than it was in the past. And that is due partly to Supreme Court rulings that changed the nature of representation of the party system in the United States. So the party system used to provide for a substantial amount of state and local input into policy making. That has been less and less the case with the rise of coercive federalism. But nevertheless, given that Congress needs to enact policies that will be somewhat, have a reasonable chance of success, they do need, in the implementation side of those policies, with the exception of the Affordable Care Act, which I just mentioned, they need to pay attention to the states in terms of implementing those policies. And so the intergovernmental system, for a variety of reasons that I was unable to go into in depth with this particular paper, continues to be pretty strong. So the policy making falls on the coercive side, the implementation falls on the cooperative side, and that's continuing to build. So we could see a time, and I think it may be coming, in which the party polarization begins increasingly to intrude upon the intergovernmental implementation side. And we saw this partly with the Affordable Care Act, which is going to lead the federal government to be more coercive in the future with regard to intergovernmental implementation. And that would be my guess as to the direction things are going.
So if I might ask something, one of the things that I've noticed during COVID as a resident of Atlanta is that, and I think this has been a dynamic throughout the country, that of course most large American cities are ruled by Democrats, and many of them are located in Republican-controlled states, and so throughout the pandemic, we observed in Atlanta, and I think many other blue cities in red states, whether it's Houston or New Orleans or you name it, were in conflict with the state governments over COVID policy. And there were all sorts of fights and even legal challenges over who had the right to determine what the COVID response was between the cities and the states. And at times, it seemed like cities might, cities were also interacting, I suppose, more directly with the federal government, bypassing states and so forth. So I suppose, so my question would be sort of how has the COVID crisis, and maybe also previous crises, if you want to speak to them, obviously New York City had a special role in the September 11th crisis. How has that kind of affected the relationships between local governments, and especially big city governments, and the states in which they're located, and maybe also the relationship between the federal government and the cities?
Yes, good question. We saw virtually none of that during the 2001 terrorist crisis and the financial crisis. So we saw the dynamic you were just mentioning primarily in the COVID crisis. And that, too, is a reflection of the party polarization. So, yes, the majority of our big cities are controlled by Democrats. And in states where the state government is controlled by the Republican Party, as was the case in Georgia, also in Texas, for example, even in the state capital, the city of Austin, where the state capital is located, is predominantly Democratic, even though the state government is Republican. So we saw this party polarization, and as I mentioned, the parties disagreed on the solutions to the COVID crisis. So the Democratic cities wanted to shut down the schools and businesses, they wanted mask mandates and so forth, and the Republicans who control state governments in those cases were opposed to those kinds of policies. So it's an interesting new dynamic that has developed over the last 15 years or so, in which these Democratic cities in particular are going in policy directions that are in conflict frequently with the Republican state government, and we saw that very significantly in the COVID crisis. That has given rise to a considerable increase in kind of coercive state-local relations, in which state governments have been preempting the authority of local governments to enact certain kinds of policies. And in the United States, local governments are the legal creatures of the states. So the states have the authority to override local authority really pretty much whenever they wish to do so. And we've seen a tremendous increase of state preemption of local authority over certain matters. And this became much more inflamed with COVID because we also had the presidential election of 2020. And again, the Democratic cities were creating all kinds of new voting mechanisms to allow people to vote by mail, to vote by drive-through voting. I mean, all kinds of new voting systems were being established, particularly by these big cities, especially to enable marginalized minority groups that live in many of these cities to be able to vote during the 2020 election. And this really inflamed many of the Republican state governors and legislatures, and so there were battles in both Georgia and Texas, for example, over cities trying to provide increased access to voting. So this has become a new dynamic. Now, historically, the Democratic Party in Washington, D.C. Has always had a friendly relation with big cities because big cities have been Democratic for well over a century in most cases. And so there's a special affinity between Democrats in Washington and Democrats in big cities, and that's reflected also when Democrats control the Congress and the White House. The federal aid programs tend to lean toward benefiting those big cities that are controlled by Democrats more than the smaller cities or rural areas of the United States, which are likely to be controlled by Republicans. So, yeah, that is a very good question, and that is a very new and interesting development in American federalism.
Okay, do we have time for one more question? Okay.
Mr. Kincaid, I was very happy to see you. After 14, 15 years, we met at Barcelona in 2006, where I had given presentation on democracy and federalism years ago. And nice to see you again. So my question is on the US gun laws. You know, the statute that you made comes under the federal laws. There has been a lot of anger amongst the citizenry all across, I think, most states of US, and what has happened in the last few decades, leading to a lot of loss of lives in the campuses and in many cases of random shootings. And I'm also told that the state have their own laws. And what kind of a reconciliation or what kind of an arrangement can be done between the federal law and the state law to lessen this burden? There has been a lot of loss of lives in random shooting across in campuses, and you hear from time to time. And well, people generally tend to believe that it's because of the US gun laws, which have been framed by the federal statute. What role do have the state laws to play in this? Can they work out something to lessen this burden so that it doesn't go on?
I think Dr. Singh was asking about how the federal system was managing, or rather mismanaging, the issue of gun violence in the United States, and what role the states versus the federal government play.
Wow, that's a whole other subject. Yes, well, as you mentioned, I think the Supreme Court determined a number of years ago that the right to own a gun is a fundamental right under the Constitution's the Second Amendment to the Constitution. And so that's a good example of coercive federalism. We have coercive federalism. The Supreme Court is another source of coercive federalism. So that ruling really places a lot of limits on the ability of states to regulate guns. And that has obviously become a problem. And so we have been going through a lot of litigation, try to determine how much room the states have to regulate guns. And the states and also big cities are testing these limits to a great extent. So particularly in more liberal and democratic states, which tend to support more gun regulation, they are really pushing the limits of testing the boundaries of their ability to regulate guns. This is less of an issue in Republican states because they are less eager to, they're more supportive, let's say, of gun rights, as it's called. But this does set up another problematic dynamic for the federal system. States that have weak gun control laws can spread guns to other states that have more restrictive laws. And so that's kind of a new frontier of regulation. And to to what extent can the federal government step in, can Congress step in with legislation that might limit the ability of some states to be overly lax when it comes to guns. So yeah, this is very much an issue that is in flux, and we're having quite a bit of debate and conflict over that issue.
Thank you. Yeah, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor Kincaid, for speaking to us and for answering all of the questions.
So thank you very much. Again, I would have loved to have come to attend the conference in person. So.